So you've got your first models. That's fantastic. Welcome to the hobby. Run, run fast, run far. If not, then we're going to cover how to build a model from top to bottom, covering all of these topics. Check out the description for timestamps for what you're looking for. Anyway, on with the video. We're going to cover how you can start off with taking any mold injected model. We'll also have a look at resin models. First up, open up your box. Oh, get rid of this. We won't need those. No, I'm just kidding. We will need the instructions. Trust me, read through the instructions at least once before even getting started. I'm going to use a set of clippers. In this case, I'm using toning clippers, or I'm using a pair of wire cutters to actually cut out the model. I use this to take out all the large chunks of plastic so I don't blunt my good ones. Here I'm using a pair of Games Workshop, but you could also use other ones. The important point is that you want a sharp set when you're cutting away from small contact points. If you try and cut off too much plastic at once, you can cause the plastic to snap off, and you can use it as a homemade weapon as that piece flies away into nothingness. Use the trimmers to remove the bulk of the plastic possible. If you find a struggle while closing the pliers, stop, because this is where you're going to lose a piece. Now we're going to cut out all the pieces we need and compare them to our guide. And this is why you want to read through at least once. You can see here I completely missed this tiny flask, and that could have ended up in the bin if I hadn't checked for it. Resin pieces require a little bit of an extra step. With the larger pieces holding it in place, instead of using pliers, I'm actually going to use a saw to cut off these supports. I'm then going to take my resin piece and I'm going to dip it in some hot soapy water until the resin softens enough that I can snap off or cut off the missing piece. It's also worth noting that with injection molded plastic, you rarely have to wash your models, but with resin or printed models, definitely want to give them a little bit of a scrub inside of some warm soapy water. Don't overdo it, we won't want to strip the model or change it in any way. This is also a good way of softening up the supports on your 3D models before snapping them off. There really shouldn't be any force required for these supports to come off. If there is a lot of resistance, dip it in the water again. Another symptom of resin models, not really for plastic, is, as you can see here, Bendy weapon syndrome. All we're going to need is 2 cups, one of hot water and one of cold. Dip your bendy weapon in the hot water and gently flex the resin. If you start feeling it go too far, stop immediately. Once you've massaged the resin, dip it in some cold water to seal it. Repeat this until you're happy with the model's straightness. When it comes to bases, I like to protect the base rim because it requires less painting later. All I'm using is some double-sided sticky tape to wrap around the base of the model. You'll see on your model there are often either little nubules left over from the sprue, or worst of all, mould lines. Mould lines happens when you're using injected plastic and the extra plastic gets squeezed out between the 2 moulds. Here I'm using a simple blunt scalpel. Obviously, be very careful when you are using a scalpel, you don't want to put them in your finger. Always make sure that nobody has, changed the blade helpfully, and then you end up accidentally slicing your finger open. On the bright side, if you got some superglue, that's kind of what it was designed for. Be careful when you're removing mould lines from delicate pieces like this sword hilt. It would be far too easy for me to accidentally scrape off some of the detail along with the mould line. Alternatively, you could use something like this. This is Games Workshop's mould line remover, and I'm not going to lie, when I first bought this, I thought it was an absolute con. All it is a squared off piece of metal, but what you find is it doesn't dig in like a scalpel, so I can gently caress the mould lines until they eventually go away. But what are the alternatives? Maybe something like this, a file. Although to be honest with you, I would say avoid files with a passion. It's far too easy to accidentally scrape away not just what you were trying to remove, like the mould line, but instead you end up removing some of the texture. You can see here I've actually not ruined the model, but I've scuffed it up a bit too much. I'm actually going to bring in the mould liner and try and smooth out the damage that I've done, and it works fairly well. If you do want to go down the sanding approach, use one of these. Ta-da! A sand stick. Sand sticks are great because you can get them bent around different places, squeeze them into gaps, and you can actually choose from a whole variety of different grits. I bought mine off of Amazon, and as you can see here, there's more sanding sticks than I'm ever going to need. All the way down from a very low grit, which means it's a very rough texture, perfect for sanding off your fingernails, to something like this, a 3000, which is a very high grit, which is very soft and won't remove a lot of texture. Anyway, let's get this cleared up. When you're taking your model pieces out, it's very easy for them to go pinging across the room. I like to use a little bit of double-sided sticky tape stuck onto my mat.
No! God, please, no! No!
And then I'm going to stick all my pieces onto it. With all your pieces now stuck down and ready to go, grab that instruction manual and let's start pairing up the pieces. Always read a couple of steps ahead, because you never know with Games Workshop if the instructions are going to be perfectly clear. I'm looking at you, Bellacore, Blood Knights, Plague Burst Caller, all of which have the instructions wrong. Anyway, when building, always get your pieces together and set them in your instructions to make sure you've got all the parts you need. This is also a good time to check you haven't missed any. When building, consider building over the top of a tray or container for all your pieces. You've no idea how hard it is to find tiny bits of plastic in carpet. When it comes to glue, we've got a couple of choices. We could use something like poly cement that melts the plastic, similar to using a plastic glue. Games Workshop do both a thin plastic as well as a thicker plastic. You also get this handy little nozzle for getting into tight spaces. Personally, I tend to go with superglue for everything. If you make a mistake, you can always just stick it in the freezer and snap the piece off, as superglue goes fragile in the cold. I also like the fact that I can buy them in bulk and get separate little containers, so if they ever get clogged, I just take out another one. Now with your pieces chosen out, always dry fit your pieces to make sure they fit before applying any glue. Here I apply a little bit of glue onto the model and then hold the piece in place for a few seconds. Next up, I want to glue these two large pieces together, but I don't fancy having to wait. So this is where we get the superglue activator. When I apply this onto the model and then apply some superglue, what you end up with is the piece hardening straight away. Do be careful though, this is an exothermic reaction, and as you can see the smoke, it's releasing some heat as well as maybe some not so good fumes. If you don't fancy paying for this, something like baking powder works absolutely fantastic. In fact, I've seen a video where someone makes their own superglue activator by mixing this with water, which is pretty cool. To use this, apply the activator onto one side of the model and then apply the superglue to the other. Always apply the activator last, as it dries out very quickly on the model, evaporating in air. Let's put all the pieces back together. A 1, a 2, a 3, a done. Nice. When you inevitably get too much superglue all over your hands, you can actually just use some cheap nail polish remover to activate it on your hands and then peel it all off. Green stuff. We're going to fill in some gaps now, and the first way that we can do this is using green stuff. Green stuff is a two-part putty where you mix them together and you end up with, well, the eponymous green stuff. If you have more of one colour than the other, you'll actually change property, switching between something that takes longer to cure and switching between something that's slightly harder. Mix them together until they're green, and I like to roll them out into a little sausage and then pat them onto the model. Then, using your hand dipped in water or grease, you can use it to smooth out the seams so you get a nice seamless transition. When it comes to attaching your model to the base, you've got a choice. You can do it before the base has been done, or you can do it after, like I'm doing here with this orc. To pin your model onto the base, all we need to do is first stretch out a paper clip, or some garden wire, depending on what you've got here. I'm going to use a paper clip because I like to imagine this as Mr. Clippy. Remember that annoying guy from Microsoft? And I like stretching him out. Once you've got your paper clip all stretched out, all we're going to need to do is drill in a hole. You can use a hand drill, or if you want to, you can buy one of these cheap pin drills off of Amazon. Nice. Select where you want your hole to be and, well, just drill in there. If you find a cavity like I did with this wheel, use some green stuff to just take up some of the space, and then trim your wire down to size. Watch out, these can fire off the model exceedingly fast and you'll never find the other half. Unless it's buried in your other half. Mark the place on the base where you want this to be by pushing the pin against the model. Once marked out, take your pin drill and screw the hole all the way through. I'm going to drip some superglue onto the pin before pushing it through the hole. On the back side, trim the pin down to size and then you'll see this pin hold your model perfectly in place. Here I'm going to pin my vampire count onto the base. I'm just doing exactly the same steps, drilling into the bottom, adding some pins. This time I didn't know how long I needed, so I'm going to glue the pins on the other side as well. Dip it in some baking powder to make sure that it instantly hardens, and then trim off the excess. And there we have it, the complete model. If you've enjoyed this, please do like and subscribe so you can see part 2 to be how to do bases. Otherwise, continue to battle the backlog.